Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining our JCU webinar series. My name is Kim Davis and I work as the College Manager in the College of Business Law and Governance. I will be moderating this webinar. However, before we continue, I wish to acknowledge the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first inhabitants of this country and pay my respects to the traditional owners and elders, past and present, of the land in which we stand today. In the spirit of reconciliation, I also acknowledge the valuable contribution that Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples continue to make to James Cook University and the broader community. This webinar is the latest in a series where we invite our top researchers and academics to share their expertise with the local community outside the lecture theatre. This webinar will take participants on a fast-paced journey through some of the latest thinking on resilience, chaos, complexity, leadership and emotional intelligence. Before we introduce our speakers, just a bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel. I'll be monitoring this function throughout the presentation and will raise your questions with Claire and Ben when appropriate. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers this evening. Claire is a Senior Lecturer and the Director of the Conflict Management and Resolution Program at James Cook University. Claire is recognised nationally and internationally as a conflict management specialist. She holds a Master of Mediation and Conflict Resolution at the University of Queensland, is a nationally accredited mediator under the Australian standards and a certified conflict coach with Conflict Coaching International. Claire is completing her PhD in positive psychology on the topic of hope theory and depression, anxiety and stress. Her work and research interests include interfaith dialogue, coaching, leadership development and positive psychology. Ben is the Director of About Resolution, a healthcare-focused conflict management and resolution consultancy. Ben, a graduate of the JCU Conflict Management and Resolution Program, is a social worker and mental health professional, lecturer, facilitator and trainer, regularly teaching conflict management into our postgraduate public health and nursing subjects. Ben has published work on neuro leadership and conflict engagement in healthcare settings and conflict coaching in complex adaptive systems. Ben is currently the Patient Safety Officer at the Townsville Hospital and Health Service. Tonight we are thrilled to be joined by Claire and Ben, who are here to speak about how we can optimise our work and engage our best thinking when we are working in the space between order and chaos.
Well, thanks very much, Kim. Look, I too would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which, at least I'm meeting today, and that's the Woolgoorukaba, Garrambilbara and Bindal people and their elders past, present and emerging. Look, I want to thank Kim for facilitating for us today, and also to Hannah and Aaron from the JCU marketing team for organising this event tonight. You know, bringing people together, particularly in the current sort of situation as communities of professional learners, is a really, really important space for sharing new ideas when we can't be coming together in universities. And we know events like this don't put themselves on, so I really want to thank Hannah and the team for inviting me along today. So about 7 years ago, I had a conversation that radically shifted the way I saw workplaces, the way I saw anywhere where people come together in complex systems. And that's what I'm going to talk a bit about today. So by way of background, I just started working in this specialised area of healthcare known as patient safety. Now, in patient safety, we're the people who go in after there's been an incident or an accident or an unexpected outcome in a hospital or in a clinical setting. We do the investigation, we find out what happened, and we ideally craft some recommendations to reduce the likelihood of this event happening again. So for example, if you go in for a knee replacement and the doctor stitches up an instrument inside your knee, then we're going to be interested in sort of coming down and asking a few questions to work out what happened. Or if you go in to have your appendix out and you come out with a pacemaker in, We'll certainly be there to ask a few questions, but fortunately that hasn't happened just yet. But you can imagine, as a patient safety officer, I was in some senses quite unpopular within the hospital. So a lot of friends, I'd worked there for 10 years, and I had a lot of friends who would start to cross the corridor when they saw me coming. That's the kind of role that a patient safety officer holds in the hospital. So I was new to this role. I was having some trouble really getting my head around the role. The technical investigative side was okay, but the philosophy of risk and the philosophy of people's behaviour and safety was something I was really struggling with. Then I had this single, quite random conversation, which really changed my view of the world, and has practically led me down a new and exciting career path. And that's what I'm going to share with you now. See, one of the great privileges, the great benefits of working in this space of patient safety is that you get to take this real bird's eye view of the healthcare system, the specific mechanisms and nuances of how care is provided and how outcomes occur in these complex organisms that are our hospitals. And I remember clearly this one day I was speaking to a colleague, a very learned and wise intensive care physician who may well be joining us today. So hello if you are, you know who you are. He said to me, Ben, show me a team or a unit or a ward who are cohesive, you know, who can negotiate, who can problem solve, who can find something they like about each other, whom you also worry about from a safety and a governance perspective. I thought about this long and hard, and I thought about each of the 60 or so teams or wards that I knew who were cohesive, and who I worried about from a safety and a governance.
Sorry to interrupt you there, Ben. You're just buffering a little bit. Maybe if you just try turning your video off, and we'll just watch the slides if that's okay.
I can do that. Let me just find that. And you come in and tell me again if it happens again. I should have had a picture of me on my profile, and then at least you'd still be looking at me. All right, you jump in again if that happens. Did we miss? Were we okay with the content, Kim?
We are.
Okay. So I thought long and hard about this. I thought about, you know, all these teams that I knew and knew well, and I couldn't identify one who got along well and who I worried about from a safety and a governance perspective. And I realised that the reverse was also true. So those wards, the units that I was visiting more and more often from a patient safety perspective, because they were punching above their weight in terms of the frequency or severity of incidents or accidents, they'd always be characterised by this undercurrent of fractured cohesion, of toxic communication, of the seeming inability to do conflict well. So this was a real epiphany for me, and I began to see all of my work, including my patient safety work, through this really visceral relationship between our ability, or my ability as a practitioner to negotiate, to collaborate, to problem solve, and the safety and quality of the healthcare that I was providing to patients. So I pursued this idea through quite some years then, several years of practice and of scholarship. I came back and did a master's with Claire, which I'm eternally grateful for, a master's of conflict management and resolution. I had some great opportunities then on the back of that to consult, to teach, to publish, to develop curricula. It's been a really incredible few years to work in this space. And it's also immeasurably improved my clinical and my leadership practice. And if everything I've come across in this space can be distilled into one single concept or model, it's the edge of chaos. It's called the edge of chaos. And that's what I'm going to spend the rest of this presentation talking through and explaining implications of it. So edge of chaos is originally the brainchild of an anaesthetist by the name of Cook and a safety engineer by the name of Rasmussen. It's been expanded on here locally in Townsville by my colleagues who might well be joining me, Andrew Johnson and Paul Lane. So here's how it goes. Kim, can I get a thumbs up if you're hearing me okay?
Yes, Ben, we're hearing okay. And just a question, we're on the Y slide. Is that the slide we should be on, or are you moving
Just
to
about to flick slides to the next one, so thank you. No, that's good, because I just had one of those notifications about an unstable internet connection, which makes you nice and comfortable when you're presenting a live webinar, doesn't it? So edge of chaos. Excellent. So here's how it goes. This is you. It might be in a hospital, in a tertiary education, might be in a bank, in the resource sector, but this is you in your workplace. This is that continuum of operating points that we're all on at some point throughout every single day. So on the one end, down near the speaker's videos there, is that operating point where everything's really quite chill, where the resources that you've got available to you and your team comfortably meet the demands that are coming in. So I speak from a hospital perspective. This is, you can imagine, when we've got a few free beds on the ward, when we've got a fully staffed roster, when there's no critical or unstable parts. Everything's ticking along just really quite well. You can picture what this looks like in your own workplace or context. Theoretically it exists, but obviously we don't see that very often at all, but it's there in theory. Down the other end of the continuum is the point that we're far more familiar with. It's where the demands that are placed on us or our teams far outstrip the resources that we have available. So again, in a hospital context, this is when we might have no free beds. We've got patients queuing up in the emergency department or waiting for admission. There's unplanned absences on the nursing team. There's acutely unwell patients. You'll know what this looks like in your own practice context, where the demands on you far outweigh the resources that you have. Now, theoretically, there's a place on this continuum, and Claire's going to talk us through this more in her section. There's a place on this continuum where we do our best thinking, where we do our best decision making, our best collaboration. And there are a few psychologists from the beginning of last century by the name of Yerkes and Dodson who tell us that it's actually not down near the video panel down on the left-hand side there, where we've got an awful lot of resources and not a lot on, that indeed, as humans, we need some degree of tension, some degree of pressure to actually bring out our best performance. So we're going to place this line here, and for reasons that we will only partially unpack during this webinar, it's called the edge of chaos, or that optimal operating point where we're working at our best. But what we also know through a lot of different scholars and schools is that too much pressure, too much stress, and our engagement and our decision making quickly begins to deteriorate. And we'll locate this point here. And again, for reasons that we'll only partly unpack, this is called the accident boundary. The accident boundary. So we know that we're past the accident boundary. We know we're operating past this point because we start to lose control over the outcomes of our work. And despite our best efforts, our best intentions, unintended and negative outcomes and consequences and accidents start to happen more often when we're operating in that space. In a hospital, that's when we start to see communication issues. We start to miss when patients are deteriorating. We start to see issues with medication, those sorts of things. Again, you know what that will look like in your own space when we start to lose control over the outcomes of our work. And what we know about organisations, particularly in, perhaps particularly in 2020, but particularly in the modern state, is that there's this range of pressures or influences which are constantly pushing teams or groups of people towards the accident boundary in a way that's seemingly quite blind to the fact that there is in fact this optimal operating point somewhere along the line. Now, again, this will look different in your own industry, but in healthcare, we're talking about economic pressures, that always doing more for less. When you find one efficiency or saving, to always try and cut, 2% of your budget each year. I'm probably talking to a bunch of university people who are living and breathing this at the moment. But there's those economic pressures that are pushing people towards the accident zone. There's clinical pressures, in our community where we're experiencing increasing burden of chronic disease, of obesity, of diabetes, and increasing sort of complexities there. Political pressures. This is those key performance indicators, where if you're a patient, or if you're a member of the community, you'll see in the paper coming up to election time, you'll see, articles or images about waiting lists, about, time spent in the emergency department. Those aspects of our work that gets politicised and suddenly becomes very, very felt very strongly by people on the front line, those political pressures. And of course, workloads. Now, again, what we know about these things is that even though a lot of these things are good in and of themselves, and they're nearly all well-intentioned, they're essentially, the way they're applied or the way they're experienced by people at the front line is that they're quite blind to the fact that there's this optimal operating point, and they're constantly pushing people past the edge of chaos towards the accident boundary. Now, that all sounds a bit gloomy, but here's something we also know right across any sort of safety field in an organisation. And that is that for most of the time, we operate where the face is here now. We operate right at that sort of point of edge of chaos. We get excellent outcomes most of the time. So the question is why? What is it that operates in this space here that helps us to stay at that edge of chaos despite these pressures pushing us towards the accident boundary? What is it that helps us in complex emergency departments or operating theatres to still get the right result 99.9% of the time, despite these pressures and despite things going wrong along the way?
And Ben, just to jump in there, I've got a great question that has come in.
Thank you.
Malcolm is really interested if dictatorial management styles rather than collaborative styles add to the risk aspects of crossing the control/chaos accident boundary. Great question.
Certainly. Thank you, Malcolm. So the theoretical background to all of this sits really nicely within a distributed leadership sort of complex organisation, where you might have theoretically a hierarchy and a line of reporting, but in reality, people will go to whoever's helped them out best last time, or they'll do whatever's worked best for them last time, despite what the rules say. And we'll touch on that in a moment in terms of what keeps people safe. So you're absolutely right. Within healthcare, we're very interested at the moment around this idea of complexity and how we're not a lineal sort of straightforward organisation. And this whole system and what I'm about to explain about resilience fits very much into as a good explanatory model for a space where there is a distributed style of leadership. So I might continue on that point, please. Thank you, Malcolm. So what is it, according to this model, that keeps people continuing to operate in this edge of chaos, this optimal operating point that stops us from being pushed across the accident boundary? It's essentially, what is our resilience in these sorts of organisations? Now, fortunately for us, this is where there's been a huge local impact in Townsville. My learned colleagues, Andrew Johnson and Paul Lane, have spent a lot of time mapping and creating some work for this space. And they've come up with this concept called the 10 Cs. Now, the 10 Cs are 10 traits of resilience that are present in every team to a greater or lesser degree. And our overall understanding of resilience is a sort of, a nexus or the sum total of these 10 traits that every team has. So I'm going to work through them now. So the first trait is cohesion. No surprise here. I mean, this is the first thing that people usually say when I say what keeps you operating safely when you've got these pressures. Cohesion, it's that mutual respect, that finding something that they're able to respect about each other. Cognition. In a healthcare setting, as well as others, this is about being able to engage the right style of thinking for the right situation and being aware of our own bias and potentially having options to mitigate our own cognitive bias. So that's cognition. Competence. Quite clearly, this is about our technical skills of being able to do our job, whether it's in a theatre or in a community clinic. But competence, the technical skills that we bring. Constraints. Now, this one is almost out of the military. This is not This is about an awareness of our constraints, a situational awareness of what the constraints are that we're operating under. So the limits of the particular clinic or theatre or setting that we're in, having an awareness of those is important. Communication within a healthcare setting, this is about not only our ability to communicate effectively, but also to receive messages. Culture, obviously this is about our shared values and beliefs around safety. Challenge, this is a really important one in a lot of different industries. This is about being able to challenge authority gradients, being able to speak up when somebody sees something going wrong. So many incidents we've had have either been rescued or saved by a junior doctor or a member of nursing staff who's been able to speak up for safety. And certainly this has been a key theme in other industries too. So the way that we set up our teams and our culture for people to be able to challenge upwards is a really, really important aspect of resilience. Clear ownership. And this is a really, really interesting one. This is about having clear ownership over each task and knowing what your task is in a team-based situation. Capture, this is about our ability to capture really good quality real-time data about what's going on in our environment. So, you know, in a health setting, this is all about the bedside monitoring and the e-health capacity that we have now to know in real time where every patient's at who's on our wards, and our ability to really be able to respond very quickly in that sort of context. And compliance. Now, this isn't about complying with every rule. This is about knowing when compliance is absolutely required and knowing when we're able to flex to still get the best outcome when unexpected things happen along the way. But to know when we can safely and when we need to flex on the rules, we need to firstly understand the rules or the guidelines that were set out that are set out for us. So we have this situation now. Usually in a room full of people, I'm seeing lots of people nodding their heads because they're kind of able to relate this to their own workplace settings. Now I can't see you nodding your heads, but if you're not, I can guarantee you that the other 140 people who are on this webinar are nodding their heads. This is quite often a light bulb moment. What we essentially have here is a model or a setting for complex organisations. I'm going to try flicking my camera back on and see how that goes. What we have here is a model for complex organisations or complex workplaces where we've got these constant pressures that are pushing us towards the accident boundary, and they're kind of blind in the way that they're applied to this optimal operating point, which is somewhere near this edge of chaos. It's an equilibrium, and we've got these traits of resilience which keep people operating in that safe spot. And we've got this idea about what those traits are. And so, for example, I might come onto a team and there's it's a young team, and so what they may not have in competence, they might make up for in communication, in cohesion, in culture, or vice versa. If I come on and it's a very experienced team working with me, they may be very competent. They may have a good culture, but they may be lacking in other spaces like compliance or cognition. So discovering the resilience of a team using this model is about understanding where those strengths and weaknesses are. I'm just going to briefly talk about how I've applied this in a team setting. Now, one of the really great ways that this has been applied locally is in an early warning system for an intensive care unit, where basically they mapped in a way that's never been mapped before the resilience of this intensive care unit to understand when things were about to get pressured. So they were able to understand, all the different, inputs from the emergency department, from the operating theatres, but also on a staff level, understanding the different makeups of their teams. And they were able to really see some tangible outcomes in terms of the access and the quality and the safety of the care in that intensive care unit by setting up some almost sort of red, amber, green early warning systems based on these 10 C's and this edge of chaos. One of the ways that I've used it recently was with a team of clinicians who do an incredibly challenging, complex line of work. And I wrote up the 10 C's on each of the, on a poster like this, and got them to vote with dots, green dots for the areas that they felt that they were self-rated, that they were strong in as a team, and red dots for those that they felt they were not so strong in as a team. And what you can see, I've done this a few times, is that there's often quite a good amount of cohesion between what the whole team put. So that, you know, if a red dot goes in one square, there'll be a few red dots or greens. And then we use that essentially as the basis for sort of a facilitated process of identification and problem solving of what some of those areas were that they needed to build some systems around. So look, that's the crux of what I wanted to present today. It's a model that really suits nicely in complex organisations to explain how outcomes occur. It's had some really nice local development at the Townsville Hospital. And what we're going to lead into now is Claire's going to focus a lot more on this edge of chaos, this optimal operating point. She's going to talk about it in terms of flow and how we can really find and move into that flow on an individual level. So I'll hand over to Claire.
Thanks so much, Ben. So yeah, no, that was just great. And recognising, I think, that within teams, that there is this balance that you're trying to achieve with everyone being able to work efficiently and effectively together, and particularly in that context you're describing in healthcare, safely together. And yeah, so I'll now follow on and talk a little bit more about the individual. And I will start by introducing this theory of flow. So if I could have the next slide, thanks, Ben. So this theory of flow, it's similar to the concept of edge of chaos, and it's where you can be referred to as being in the zone or being in the groove. So for individuals, it's this equilibrium state where you're engaged in a task and it's somewhere between that boredom and anxiety state. So someone who is in this mental state of flow operation, you're performing very actively, you're fully immersed in what you're doing, engaged, focused, and have enjoyment in the process of the activity that you're doing. So you can see here on this particular slide that flow here is measured according to task difficulty. So that's listed there as challenge on the y-axis, and then personal ability are listed there as skill on the x-axis. So why is this important that you as an individual would recognise when you're in a state of flow? Well, exceptional performance of a task or building of knowledge or skills requires two key things, and that's deliberate practice and the right working conditions. And both of these are connected to flow. And a little bit of how Ben's just described his teams working together would be trying to achieve a team dynamic of this state of flow. Now, research into performance and talent and mastery, they've actually found that the biggest contributing factor to developing expertise or your peak performance of a task depends on the quality of your practice or the quality of time that you put into it. So if you're training or working to develop a skill, that deliberate practice is focusing on things that you can't do well, or trying to work so that you're going to be most effective when you're delivering that particular skill or requirement. And you'll find that that deliberate practice, if you're in that balance or that zone of flow, it will be most effective. So deliberate practice is also required when you need to get things done. So if you've got that deadline or an important output that needs to be delivered, then deliberate practice that is dedicated to that job is essential. And in one famous study that looked at this role of deliberate practice, it was, according to Erickson and his colleagues, they actually found also that working in solitude was where the real work gets done, when participants could be quite focused and in that state of flow. So that's an interesting consideration around dynamics that require key teams as well as individual outputs. So we know that flow is important for us to get our work done, but what are the right working conditions for flow? Next slide, thanks, Ben. So here are some references to research in this area. Tom DeMarco and Timothy Lister, they conducted a really interesting study called the Coding War Games. So they compared 600 computer programmers across 92 different companies, and they gave them all the same task. That task was to design, code, and test a program working within their normal office space and during normal business hours. Interestingly, they found that people from the same company performed at roughly the same level, regardless of years of experience, salary, or even the amount of time spent completing the project. And in fact, the most enormous performance gap that they found over the quality of the final products was between organisations and the different working conditions at those organisations. So the top performers in this particular study, the working conditions that those organisations allowed for included privacy, personal space, control over their physical environment, and freedom from interruption.
And Claire, that's a great segue into a great question that's been posted by Robert, who says, what about the impact of unsuitable workspaces? Too loud, too many distractions and other people talking when you need to concentrate, chemical smells, etc. How does this affect flow, and where would that point be on that slide?
Fabulous question, Robert, and exactly what I'm going to segue into now. So, no, thank you for highlighting that, because there are obviously different considerations for people in their workplaces for, you know, if you're front of house, if you're customer facing, compared to if you're able to work privately in an office, and how do people as an individual deal with those different types of environments. So I'll mention one great book here. I've got it on the slide there, authored by Susan Cain, called Quiet, which is around the power of introverts in a world that can't stop talking. And in it, Cain explores the impacts of stimulation on individual performance. So she highlights this difference, and she talks about it in terms of introverts and extroverts, but also a spectrum around the level of stimulation that individuals can work with. So imagine a spectrum of stimulation where at one end you're understimulated and the other end you're overstimulated. So here's an example of this type of a scenario. So you need to write a report or produce a written output for your workplace. And you're sitting at your home or in your office, it's quiet, you're alone, and you sit down to read. And then you find you're reading the same paragraph over and over again, and you're not taking it in, and you're just not concentrating. You may be understimulated. So you go to a coffee shop. There are other people around you. They're engaging in their own conversations, working on their own computers. You don't have to interact with them. You're in control of the environment in the sense that you can choose where you want to sit in that coffee shop, and you can leave whenever you want to. You might find that you can concentrate better then and focus on your own work. So you found a balance of stimulation. However, then you get an email from someone, it's important, you realize you need to carefully consider your reply. All of a sudden, the sound of people talking, the clinking of the coffee cups, the sound of the dishwasher at the coffee shop, it's overwhelming. And you need to go to your private office or an isolated space, shut the door and work in solitude and silence. You were overstimulated and you needed to rebalance. So there is an optimal level of stimulation that's individual to you. And that level of stimulation will change depending on the day, the context of the work you're doing, and your well-being in that moment. So just being aware of your level of stimulation that you require and recognizing when you're under or overstimulated can be a really important awareness for maintaining your personal balance.
So Claire, in there, do you think that then it's important for workplaces to can have consideration regarding flexible working balances, which we've learned a lot from COVID?
Absolutely. And I think COVID has given us this really unique opportunity to recognise for us as individuals what we like about different environments, because there's been a bit of a change for some people into how they've been able to manage, particularly their working conditions. So a shout out to all the Melburnians in particular who've been working and living from their homes for the last few months. Recognising within that context, if you're under or overstimulated within your own environment and what works for you better or differently in a work context, just again, it's that important awareness for yourself around what you need to maintain balance. And just also on this key of stimulation, whether or not you feel overstimulated in some situations, it's not just a personality trait. There's actually a physiological response in your brain that has you reacting to stimuli. So you can actually be born a high reactive person. So someone who's highly attuned and sensitive to your environment and to new sights, sounds and smells, as Robert mentioned earlier. Or you could be a low reactive, so you're not as attuned or influenced by your environment. And we actually have got a lot of really interesting research around development psychology, personality traits and emotion. And Jerome Kagan is one particular researcher who's been extremely influential. He actually did some experiments with small babies and would pop balloons behind their head or get them to inhale the scent of alcohol from a cotton bud held under their nose and do sort of other things to try and stimulate them, and would measure their reaction. So low reactive babies would stay quite quiet and placid and were not so affected by the sounds or smells, whereas high reactives would cry and pump their arms and legs. So Kagan found that this innate temperament, which is biologically based, can influence personality factors later in life, such as your preferred level of stimulation in the environment, and even your extrovert or introvert preferences.
And Claire, that's a great segue to a question from Kenneth, who says, one of the challenges of a manager is to achieve high arousal, which can result in giant steps and manage anxiety, the latter which is quite individual. Any clues as to how a manager might build these tensions into the workspace?
Great question. Exactly. I will sort of get to this a little bit in a later slide, but a lot of it comes down to, for individuals, personal awareness, so that they're able to clearly articulate what you might need at a particular time or in order to get a particular job done well. But then also for organisations to recognise there's a huge productivity issue with staff who are being over or understimulated and not working in that optimal level of flow. And when we talk about individual peak performance, when you get too far into the stress and the equivalent of Ben's accident and boundary zone, that's when you start to see a lot of real consequences, such as absenteeism, presenteeism within offices, which is even sometimes a greater cost to the bottom line than absenteeism. When people are turning up to their work but not working as productively as they could be because of their work environment.
Claire, that leads nicely into another great question from Malcolm. Does this flow state achieve greater efficacy where the skill sets of an individual align more with the team skill sets or exceed group talents? So he's thinking about the person who is outside the group norm and potentially is disruptive by being overbearing or perceived as threatening to others to the point of lowering group morale.
Oh, really good question.
Yeah.
I think when you're working in teams, a lot of those points that Ben highlighted around cohesion and being able to work together with similar or like working environments can be really important to consider. And, I'm not going to touch on every, influencing factor that there can be within effective teams or what you can be aware of as an individual. But some key points to highlight around these things, such as over or under stimulation or being a high or low reactive, is if you are one of those people that's high reactive, so you require more solitude, silence, or individual work to get the job done, and you're in a team with someone who is different to that, it can be a real challenge to find an equilibrium because compromise doesn't work. So if you're in an open plan office environment, for example, and there's a lot going on and someone needs to lower the stimulation, but other people need to raise it, if you say, oh, okay, well, let's just go halfway, you're always going to have both of you over and understimulated. No one's going to be as productive as they could be. So yeah, that really is a balancing act. Thank you. Great questions. Yeah, I'll just follow on before I move on to the next slide that interestingly, when Kagan did this research, he's also described that many people who are high reactives tend to pick pursuits that allow them to be in charge of their own environment. So high reactives tend to go into roles where they can close the door, pull down the shades, do their own work. And high reactives aim to protect themselves from encountering unexpected things and aim to control their own environment to a greater extent. So there could be even a little bit of self-protection mechanisms in there, and maybe that's an answer to some of those previous questions as well. So next slide, thanks, Ben. So back on this diagram of flow, so additional considerations then for finding that state of equilibrium will be the level of stimulation you prefer for the task at hand or you feel you require on that day, as well as your predisposition to being high or low reactive to stimulation. So again, if you're a low reactive, you may be able to handle more naturally loud and volatile environments or environments with higher stimulation. If you're a high reactive, you may prefer environments with lower levels of stimulation. Next slide, thanks, Ben. Now, Ben touched on this as well. Some stress is good. So we do need some positive stress in our lives, but not too much, because that will send us over the edge of our equilibrium into chaos. So our levels of stress can affect us, particularly if we're constantly overstimulated. Now, to understand what's happening in the body when you're in that constant state of overstimulation, I'm just going to very quickly and simply explain a little bit about how the brain works. So apologies to any medical professionals or neuroscientists who might be watching this explanation. But the next slide, thanks, Ben. In very lay terms, how the brain works. We have a lizard brain, which is the oldest part of our brain responsible for our basic biological functions. We then have our emotional brain that manages our intuition, instinct, and emotional responses to situations. So that famously described fight, flight, or freeze response. Then our rational brains that manage our higher order thinking, logic, and reasoning. And then we have a small almond-shaped trapdoor between our rational and emotional brain called the amygdala. And when we are engaging with external stimuli, when we're not stressed, don't sense any danger, information comes in, decision-making occurs with input from both our rational and emotional brain centers. However, when your body senses danger or has an emotional reaction to external stimuli, our amygdala flips. And this is colloquially referred to as an amygdala or an emotional hijacking. So information enters your brain, goes into the, goes to the emotional brain. It is prevented from accessing the rational brain. So as a result, you react without rational input. So when your fight, flight, or freeze response is triggered, in that short term, you get adrenaline in your body. In the long term, cortisol is released into your blood as a management response to that stress. So your body is flooded with hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, and you are then needing to operate in that state. So
I just want to, sorry, just to jump in there, a couple of questions. One question is around, can we talk about the, high stress roles that involves a lot of multitasking, what the impact of that is? And then I've got another great question that's come in from Christine. So do you want to do the stress part, the multitasking first, and then I'll ask Christine's question?
Yeah, no worries. Well, just to mention that if you are multitasking, it's actually a bit of a furphy. And, you know, research now says that you can actually only focus on one task at a time. So you're actually diverting your attention from one task to another each time that you move tasks. And so it's unlikely you would actually get into a state of flow. And we haven't actually mentioned, and I won't get to go into it, how technology has disrupted the way in which our brains are wired and the ability of people to get into a state of flow as well. But anecdotally, I've had colleagues that have said, you know, I used to be able to concentrate for 3 or 4 hours at a time. Now I'm lucky if I can concentrate on one task for 15 minutes. So again, that practice and the way in which our minds are focused is a really important consideration for how we work.
Very interesting. So a question, as I said, I've got a couple now. So from Christine, do you depend upon subjective feedback, or do you also use the kinds of tech that allow for more objective feedback, e.g. feedback on flow or coherence through a miniaturized personal tech like an affordable EEG?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question, Christine. So depending on the types of studies that have been conducted, some are personal subjective measures of your own state that you're in. There have been, though, in order to, I guess, scientifically discover how the mind operates and the way in which we operate under stress, research conducted that map the brain waves, brain activity, heart rate, take blood tests for cortisol levels and stress hormone responses and that type of thing. So this area of research, particularly in the last 20 years, when a focus on more positive psychology aspects have become very popular, the amount of research in this area has just exploded. In fact, the last time I was at the National Mediation Conference, which is the seminal conference for mediators and conflict resolution practitioners in Australia, nearly every keynote speaker and every other presenter was speaking about neurobiology, the mind, mindfulness, and how that relates to human beings, human behaviour, human wellness, and then their performance, and particularly in that context, how they then respond in conflict situations or manage high stress situations.
Thank you. And a comment from Karen, which ties nicely into that. So we've, you know, at least decades of elevated stressful work environments can add years to one's life or not.
Well, again, some people have different levels of stress, like optimal stress operation, and can handle those situations and be in their zone. And then there's other people that can't and do need to manage that for their own health and well-being. So, yeah, thinking about, going back to this amygdala, how important that is to regulating our stress hormone responses, our adrenal output, and that biochemical balance in our brains and bodies. You get completely out of whack when you're not in that sort of optimal operating level. And tying into that question actually that you just had, because we all do have personal amygdalas and we have personal triggers that will flip us into that fight or flight response. And as I just mentioned, some people will have particularly excitable amygdalas or be born high reactives who are more attuned to new sights, sounds, smells, people coming and going, and will be more likely to be feeling that they're operating in a high stress situation. It can take less than 33 milliseconds for an emotional hijacking to occur, and then more than 20 minutes for the body to recover from that release of hormones. So if you've got a more reactive amygdala, that means you can be triggered by an experience and more likely to have higher heart rate, you get dilated eyes, tighter vocal cords, even muscle strain due to all that release of cortisol and stress hormones. And if you're in a work environment, as just highlighted, work environments are getting more stressful. If you're constantly managing those amygdala hijackings, that can be exhausting. So you can imagine a lot of conflict can also occur in the workplace and at home due to individuals having these different preferences for levels of stimulus, and then also for people's different personal triggers around their amygdala. So the next slide, thanks, Ben. Yeah, so just highlighting again, some stress is good. It's motivating, gives us focus and energy to stick to a task. But if you're constantly in that state of amygdala hijacking, then your body is in chaos. So you have that biochemical imbalance, and it can lead to the negative consequences of stress. So as listed there on the slide, they could be fatigue, exhaustion, ill health, breakdown, and burnout. You might even start to experience physical symptoms of adrenal exhaustion and long-term stress and anxiety, such as headaches, irritability, poor sleep, poor diet, which leads to mental exhaustion and physical exhaustion. So scientifically, this is described as the point where I'm just too tired to care. So when you've reached that point, you're beyond your equilibrium and you need to focus on what you can do to bring it back to that healthy level of stress. So what actions can you take? Well, you probably already know a lot of them. It's all that conventional wisdom. So it's exercise, good diet, relaxation, listening to music, playing with animals, taking a bath, mindfulness. And what we're seeing now in this academic field of how important this is, there's a real growth in scientific studies and dedicated research to finding out what works and how it works. So I'm of the opinion that stress reduction is often just as personal and individual for what works for you as what it is that causes you stress. So if you're looking to improve your personal balance and recognize your optimal working conditions, I'd recommend to start keeping a diary. So recognize when you're feeling good. What is it that is going well? What's happening around you? What was present or absent in your environment? What did you eat or drink that day? What was going on in your personal or professional life at that time? And then as well, when you recognize you've experienced an emotional hijacking, what was the trigger? How did you recover? What worked well? What would you do differently next time? What can you learn from that experience? Because this greater understanding of self is really key to your own emotional intelligence, as well as for you to be able to articulate to other people in your team or organization what you need in order to work optimally.
Claire, that's great. And I just to give you some feedback, comments coming through, that's really resonating with people, and they absolutely want you to send the slides through. So that's great.
Oh, fantastic. Great. Because like I said, we can't discuss all of the factors that can influence that state of flow today, but hopefully what I've highlighted or raised will just spark some thinking for you and be helpful in understanding yourself and what your personal preferences might be like moving forward. Next slide. Thanks, Ben. So to leave you, like, what are the top 3 things to remember when considering how you as an individual can maintain your balance and stay on that right side of the edge of chaos? It's awareness, awareness, and awareness. So I've described that concept of flow and how it's that mental state. It's important for individuals to flourish, and that there's that range of spectrums that you can consider for yourself, such as over and under stimulation, being high or low reactive, or introvert extrovert scales, and all the impacts that have on your mind and body. Because once you're aware of yourself, you can start to make conscious choices around your environment and your optimal working conditions. And then what you need to engage in deliberate practice and find the right working conditions for the task at hand. And that presence of flow is also really essential to a person's overall well-being. And all of this ties into Ben's presentation around those peak conditions for performance for teams and an organisation overall. Because if you're working well as an individual, then the likelihood of being able to work well in terms of those cohesion and communication within a team is more likely then to benefit your organisation in finding that right balance. So next slide, thanks, Ben. Now, if you're interested in learning any more about these concepts and how they relate to communication, leadership, and management, we offer an entire postgraduate master's program in conflict management and resolution at James Cook University. I'm the director of that program, and please feel free to contact me if you have any questions about study in this area. So I'd like to thank you all so much for being here this evening or listening to the recording at a later stage. And thanks, Ben. If you can stop sharing now, Kim, we might just pass over to see if there's any other questions or...
I've had just lots of comments coming through, so thank you everybody. I've even had somebody say, so thank you. It is a brilliant course, life-changing. Well done, Ben and Claire. This has been really informative and great. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you both so much. Insightful and engaging. So we're just super excited to have that feedback. Thank you so much from everybody. So I've still got little comments popping up. So now I'll just pop in one more time to make sure that we've got just lots of really positive comments. So I think most people have their questions, and as we know, people can reach out to you. So thank you so much, Claire and Ben, for this wonderful presentation, and thank you to all of the audience who joined us this evening and made it so wonderfully interactive. We'd really appreciate your feedback so that we can continue to deliver interesting and engaging webinars throughout this series. If you wouldn't mind sparing some time to complete our feedback survey, that would be fantastic. A link should appear once the webinar concludes. So stay tuned for our next webinar on the 22nd of October, presented by JCU's Hayley Letson on Not All Superheroes Wear Stethoscopes, and hear how Hayley overcame the many obstacles she faced on her Plan B career journey, and how she's inspiring the next generation of doctors to engage with and contribute to the many research breakthroughs that are needed for medicine to progress into the future. So thank you, everybody, and good evening.